Today we're going to talk about cells and some simple cells known as the prokaryotic cells, a type of cell that we'll start with here because it's simple and easy to understand. We're going to start in your notes on part B, and we're going to talk about the basic idea of the cell theory. It's believed that all living things are made up of cells, and these cells are what's called the basic units of life. They make up all living things. A living thing is called an organism. And it's believed that they are the smallest units of life. In other words, anything that happens in a living thing happens at a cellular level. So they're the smallest thing that can make up all of the activities that make up a living organism. And the final part of the cell theory is that all cells come from a pre-existing cell. Cells come from other particular cells. Unfortunately, what the cell theory doesn't tell us is how that first cell was able to get formed. And if you dive into evolution and things like that, there's some ideas, and later on we'll talk about the synthesis of biological molecules in non-living things, but there isn't really a working theory on how those first cells actually came. All right, let's talk about how cells were kind of discovered. Robert Hooke was a scientist that coined the term cell, and what he was doing was using a microscope, and he was looking at sections of cork, and what cork is nothing more than dead wood. And so the cork that he was looking at should look like a little bit like this, and so you can see that the dead wood, which you're looking at right here, we now know is the cell walls, and there's nothing else in there because the cells died and they're gone, and the remnants are just the walls left over. And so as he was looking at this, what he thought of is that, hey, this looks like kind of like the rooms that monks lived in when they were at monastery, and those were called cellula. And so based on this term for the rooms in a monastery, they were called cellula, he coined the term cells. And this is one of the first ones where you had evidence of a sub-level of, in this case, what would be wood. Obviously, Leeuwenhoek, when he invented the microscope, he was able to see pond protists. The word cell hadn't been created yet. They didn't know what those animals particularly were. They didn't even know they were single cellular at the time. There was no concept of that at the point in time. So that's where the word cell came from. And based on the ability of being cells, you can break celled organisms down in a couple of different groups, which you're familiar with from middle school. Unicellular organisms only consist of one particular type of cell, and I have pictures here. This over here on the left is amoeba, which you're going to look at under the microscope here in a little bit, or already have been if this is a video that's being watched kind of in the future. And then over here on the right you have amoeba, which you probably won't see as a live version in the microscope because they're very difficult to actually see. You got to actually know what you're doing, and I don't, and I'm very bad at harvesting amoeba. Paramecium are pretty hardy, and I can get those and grow those and get lots of them for us to see. But the amoeba, a little bit more difficult. And also, you can see that they're a little bit more clear, and so even if I had them, they're harder to see. You got to stain them so they look better. So unicellular organisms only made up of one cell. Multicellular organisms are made of many cells. And so here I have a picture of a tree, multicellular organism, and a lemur, again, multicellular organism. Now there's some advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages of being multicellular is that you have all this complexity that you have. So obviously the tree has cells that are designed to move liquids around inside and just under the bark. And then they have cells in their leaves that are designed to do certain things, whether it be protect or it be photosynthesis or things like that. So they got all kinds of different stuff. Obviously you have cells in the lemur, like in the eyes. You can see those nice brilliant yellow eyes there. So we have special cells that can see colors and things like that. Another advantage is cell specialization, which we're going to look at on the next slide. You can have different types of cells that do different types of things: bone cells, nerve cells, light absorbing cells, etc. So we talked about multicellular and single cellular life. Now let's talk about the two types of different cells, and then we're going to focus today on just the first type, which is the prokaryotic cells. So two different types of cell levels. Scientists have discovered there's actually three types of cells, but we're only going to focus on the main two here. The first of which is called a prokaryotic cells, which are known as the prokaryotes. Pro comes from the root word before, and karyon means a kernel, and the kernel that they're referring to is the nucleus. And so the word prokaryotic literally means before the nucleus. And what this means is you have an organism that does not have a cellular nucleus. The DNA is loose inside the cell. These are all bacterial cells. So bacteria are small, they're not complex, they don't have a nucleus. And they're just extremely very basic cells. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, also known as the eukaryotes, where eu meaning well and karyon still means nucleus, means a well-developed or well-seen nucleus. And you can see that, and you can stain it, and you can check those out. These are the organisms that you are familiar with. Plants, animals, funguses are the main thing that you can go out and walk around and see. And then at some point, you're going to see the protists in the pond water. It's not easy to see those. You can't see those without a microscope. Eukaryotic cells are very complex. They have lots of internal parts, including a nucleus, whereas the prokaryotic cells are very simple. So here I have just a real short schematic of a eukaryotic cell on the left, and it's got all these various parts that we're going to review. You should have learned some of these back in middle school. And then over here on the right is the prokaryotic cell, which has fewer parts, and they share some parts with the eukaryotic cell, like the ribosomes, for instance, here, and the cell membrane and the cell walls, possibly. The one thing I don't like about this picture is that it misrepresents the size relationship. Usually the eukaryotes are like 10 to 100 times larger, and so the bacterial cell, in comparison to the eukaryotic cell, would be like the size of the little blue dot. They're very tiny cells because they're very, very simple cells. Later on, we'll talk about how you move things in and out of cells and why those different parts are needed. You need parts in the eukaryotic cell to transport things that the prokaryotic cells lack, and so the prokaryotic cells just don't do as well when they're larger. Focusing in today, the last thing, the prokaryotic cell. Like I said before, all prokaryotic cells are bacteria. They're very simple cells that lack a nucleus and other internal parts. And those internal parts have a term. They're called organelles. They don't have organelles. Organelles are kind of like, you take the word organ, like your lung, your heart, your stomach. Okay, it's a big object that does a certain thing. Well, in cells, they're like little organs, and that's where the L part comes in there, L meaning tiny. So they're like tiny organs. They're just specific things inside the nucleus to do little itty-bitty things. So I have a picture of a bacterial cell, and I want you to label it, and you're going to be coloring it here in just a moment, answering a few questions about it. The blue squiggle right here, since they don't have a nucleus, the DNA is just loose. And kind of concerning for the bacteria. There's not as much protection onto the DNA as there are in the cells that we have, which are the eukaryotic cells, because we're surrounded by what's called a nuclear envelope that protects it a little bit and regulates what can go in and outside of the nucleus. But DNA is just loose in the bacterial cells. Over here, the little red dots are called ribosomes, and we'll learn later that the ribosomes are responsible for making proteins. That's the protein maker. Over here on the far right, you got this long whip-like tail. Not every bacteria has these, but I introduced it here, and we'll take a look at a video here shortly on the flagellum. Kind of a tail to help move things around. The thicker light blue color here is the cell wall, and then you'll see a dark blue, which is the cell membrane. I didn't put this on this particular picture, but there also can be encased in what's called a capsule, which is a thick coating on the outside of the cell wall even, and that's why bacteria can survive in extreme environments, because they can just be dormant for a while. Kind of protects everything for a while until there's enough water or oxygen or whatever you need in order for the bacteria to grow. You'll see this from teeny tiny little hairs. These little teeny tiny hairs you'll see a video of later are called cilia. And eukaryotic cells have cilia, and sometimes they have flagellum. If you ever get a tickle in your throat and you're coughing and you feel there's something there, that's what's causing that cough, is there's cilia in your throat, in the cells of your throat that gets kind of irritated, and it sends a nerve signal to say, hey, we need to cough. There's something stuck in our throat. We don't want it there. We're going to cough that up. So prokaryotes, very simple cells, not much else to them. All right, that is all I wanted you to cover for today. Thank you.